The pilot scanned the cabin with authority, his eyes moving row by row as if measuring people by something only he could see. When his gaze settled on the black woman seated near the front, it lingered for a moment longer than necessary. She sat upright, composed, dressed simply but elegantly, her posture relaxed yet confident. Without asking for her boarding pass or checking the seat number again, he pointed directly at her and said the seat was reserved for important personnel and that she would need to move. His tone was clipped, professional on the surface, but edged with an assumption that went unquestioned. The surrounding passengers fell silent almost instantly, the hum of conversation dissolving into an uncomfortable stillness. Heads turned. Some people pretended to look away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the safety card in the seat pocket, while others watched openly, curiosity mixed with unease. The woman did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand an explanation, though she had every right to. Instead, she looked up at the pilot calmly, her expression unreadable, and nodded once. She reached down, lifted a small leather bag from beneath the seat, and stood. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, almost graceful. As she stepped into the aisle, the reality of the moment seemed to settle heavier on the cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances, silently wondering why this was happening, why no one else was being questioned, why the pilot seemed so certain. The woman walked past the first row, then the second, her footsteps soft against the carpet, while the pilot turned away as if the matter were already resolved. What no one could see was the calculation behind her calm. She noticed everything: the flight attendant biting her lip in hesitation, the businessman in the aisle seat shifting uncomfortably, the elderly woman clutching her purse a little tighter. She noticed the pilot's shoulders relax as soon as she complied, as though her obedience confirmed something he had already decided about her. She also noticed the lack of verification, the absence of procedure, the ease with which authority had overridden fairness. None of it surprised her, but she filed each detail away carefully, like notes taken in silence. As she reached the middle of the cabin, a young flight attendant finally spoke up, her voice low and uncertain, asking the pilot if there might have been a mistake. He waved her off without looking back, repeating that the front seat was required for someone important. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Important. The woman paused for a brief second, just long enough for those nearest to her to sense something unspoken, then continued walking until she reached an empty seat near the back. She placed her bag beneath the seat, smoothed her jacket, and sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The cabin slowly returned to its low murmur, but the tension did not fully dissolve. People whispered behind cupped hands. A man across the aisle leaned toward his companion and muttered that something about the situation felt wrong. Another passenger shook her head quietly, eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. The woman at the center of it all sat still, gazing out the window as the plane prepared for departure. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, calm and composed, revealing nothing of the thoughts moving behind her eyes. She had flown countless times before, on countless airlines, in cabins far more luxurious than this one. She understood hierarchy, protocol, and the immense responsibility that came with command. She also understood how quickly assumptions were made, how easily authority could be misused when unchecked. Years earlier, she might have challenged the pilot immediately, demanded recognition, revealed who she was. Experience, however, had taught her the value of patience. Sometimes the most powerful position was the one taken in silence, allowing others to reveal themselves fully. As the aircraft taxied down the runway, a senior flight attendant reviewed the passenger manifest one final time. Her finger stopped abruptly at a name listed among the priority passengers. She frowned, reread it, then looked up, scanning the cabin. Her eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. She checked again, heart beating faster now, and whispered something to a colleague. The colleague's face drained of color as she followed the attendant's gaze toward the back of the plane. Meanwhile, the woman closed her eyes briefly, listening to the familiar sounds of flight, the whir of engines, the click of overhead bins, the muffled announcements crackling through the speakers. She felt no anger, only a quiet resolve. This was not the first time she had been underestimated, and it would not be the last. What mattered was what came next, and how the lesson would be delivered. A few rows ahead, the pilot settled into his seat, confident the cabin was in order. He reviewed his checklist, unaware of the shift happening behind him, unaware that the woman he had dismissed so easily was not merely observing for her own sake. She was observing for the sake of something much larger, something she had built with years of effort, vision, and leadership. The irony hovered invisibly between them, thick and inevitable. The plane lifted off smoothly, and as it climbed into the sky, the woman opened her eyes again, a faint smile touching her lips. No one around her noticed it, but it carried meaning far beyond the moment. She knew that by the time the flight landed, the assumptions made in this cabin would no longer remain unchallenged. For now, she remained seated quietly, an unassuming passenger to everyone else, while the truth waited patiently, ready to make itself known. As she walked calmly down the aisle to a seat farther back, the cabin seemed to hum with a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. The murmur of conversation grew in volume, quiet at first, then gradually louder, like a storm building from the horizon. Passengers leaned slightly toward each other, whispering and exchanging glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others tried to mask their curiosity behind polite pretenses. Eyes followed her every movement, some filled with sympathy, others with barely concealed judgment, yet none of them could understand the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her as she took her new seat. She placed her small bag neatly on the floor and adjusted herself comfortably, folding her hands in her lap with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Her posture conveyed nothing but calm composure, but every subtle movement, her slow turn of the head, the careful way she arranged her belongings, was a statement in itself. It was a silent message that she was fully aware of the injustice of the moment, and that she did not need to react immediately to it to assert her power. Meanwhile, a flight attendant, who had been hovering near the front of the plane with a clipboard in hand, paused mid-step. She glanced down at the passenger manifest, running her fingers slowly down the list of names as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her expression shifted from routine concentration to confusion, and then to sudden, creeping realization. The color in her face began to fade, her lips pressing together in disbelief, her eyes widening as the name she had just passed over again revealed itself in bold print, the woman who had just been moved. For a moment, she stared at the paper as if it were a trick of her own eyes, unable to reconcile the authority she thought she had witnessed at the front of the cabin with the truth now staring back at her from the manifest. She whispered to a colleague beside her, voice trembling slightly, and the other attendant's reaction mirrored her own shock, their eyes darting toward the back of the plane where the woman sat serenely. The realization was dawning slowly across the cabin staff. The passenger they had so casually moved was not just anyone. She held a status so high that their assumptions, their judgments, and their authority had no weight against it. The quiet panic was palpable, though no one dared speak aloud just yet, afraid of disrupting the fragile calm the woman herself maintained. The woman, seated now, allowed herself a brief moment to observe the scene around her. She noticed the subtle changes in the body language of those nearby, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the hesitant glances, the way the flight attendant's hands paused mid-task. It was a dance of authority and misconception, and she understood it perfectly. Years of experience, years of navigating spaces where perception was everything, had honed her ability to read a room, to sense the shift in energy that came when people realized they might have underestimated someone. She didn't need to make a scene. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand recognition outright. The power of presence, of calm observation, was more effective than confrontation at this precise moment. Every small gesture, the tilt of her chin, the slow blink of her eyes, the slight nod as she acknowledged a concerned glance from a nearby passenger, was loaded with quiet authority. She was the master of this moment, even if no one yet understood it. After a few minutes, she reached down and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The small click sounded almost inconsequential, but it drew the attention of the nearest cabin crew member immediately. The attendant approached with the practiced smile of someone trained to handle requests politely, though her posture betrayed lingering unease. The woman's voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and entirely composed, the sort of tone that demanded attention without seeming to command it. She asked to see the captain after takeoff, phrasing her request with courtesy that contrasted sharply with the tension that had built up moments before. There was no trace of irritation, no hint of indignation, only the quiet authority of someone confident in her position, someone who understood the mechanics of respect and the importance of timing. The attendant nodded quickly, understanding immediately that this was not a routine request and that it carried significance far beyond the standard protocol. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, the murmurs of passengers grew more insistent. Heads turned in her direction again, some eyes wide with curiosity, others narrowing in skepticism, and a few showing the faintest glimmer of recognition. Whispers spread like wildfire, each person trying to make sense of the juxtaposition between the deference shown by the pilot and the composed confidence of the woman seated at the back. It was a subtle ripple that ran through the cabin, touching everyone in different ways: discomfort, intrigue, admiration, and, for some, a faint sense of unease. The cabin had shifted imperceptibly from a space of routine order to one charged with anticipation. People instinctively leaned forward, drawn not by spectacle, but by the magnetic presence of someone whose authority had been so casually dismissed and yet remained undeniable. The flight attendants moved about their duties, but the air of tension lingered. Each interaction with passengers carried a slight edge, a careful choreography of politeness tempered by the unspoken awareness of the situation unfolding. Even the pilot, sitting at the front, unaware of the specific realization the cabin crew was experiencing, operated with an unintentional nervousness. He completed pre-flight checks with a sense of urgency that bordered on distraction, unaware that the woman he had so confidently instructed to move was far more significant than he could have imagined. His assumptions, grounded in superficial appearances, were about to be overturned in a way that would leave the entire crew, and the passengers, reeling. The woman's eyes moved calmly across the cabin, taking in the faces around her, the subtle reactions, and the small gestures of acknowledgement from those who sensed her authority. She was fully present in the moment, attuned to every detail, yet entirely unhurried. Each breath she took, each blink, each slight movement of her hand was deliberate. It was the quiet command of someone who did not need to assert her authority aggressively because it was already inherent in her presence. She understood that the timing of revelation mattered, that patience was often more powerful than immediate confrontation. By allowing the cabin and crew to settle into a false sense of control, she maximized the impact of the truth that was soon to be revealed. As the engines roared and the plane lifted from the ground, she reclined slightly in her seat, adjusting the small bag at her feet. The hum of the engines, the slight vibration of the aircraft, the faint click of seatbelts locking into place, all these sensory details grounded her while the anticipation in the cabin built silently. She could sense it: the crew's growing unease, the passengers' restless curiosity, the pilot's unawareness. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, yet she remained an island of calm within it, observing, waiting, understanding that the right moment to assert her presence and authority was imminent. Finally, as the seatbelt signs flickered off and the initial turbulence of climb settled into steady flight, she pressed the call button again, this time making eye contact with the attendant. Her voice, steady and polite, requested the captain's presence. There was no urgency, no harshness, only a quiet insistence that could not be ignored. The attendant, now fully aware of the significance of the request, nodded and left quickly to summon the captain, understanding that the moment was larger than protocol or procedure. The passengers watched, some still whispering, some silently anticipating what might come next. The cabin had transformed from a space of casual authority to one of quiet suspense, all because a single passenger had chosen calm observation over immediate confrontation, letting the weight of truth prepare the stage for revelation. By the time the captain approached, the cabin had become a stage set for accountability, the tension palpable yet contained. Everyone sensed that the story had not ended, it had only paused, waiting for the final act, and the woman seated with quiet authority was at the center of it all, poised and ready to demonstrate that appearances, assumptions, and superficial authority could never outweigh true command, wisdom, and presence. Minutes later, the sound of the cockpit door sliding open cut through the low hum of the cabin like a sudden crack of lightning. All at once, attention shifted forward as the pilot's confident posture faltered. He had been reviewing the instruments, checking the pre-flight systems one last time, unaware of the storm about to arrive at his side. When he looked up, the figure stepping through the doorway was the very woman he had so casually ordered to move. Her expression was serene, her movements deliberate, and her presence immediately filled the space with an authority that no uniform, badge, or procedure could rival. The pilot froze, a sensation unlike any he had felt before in his years of experience. It was as if the entire plane had contracted around a single moment, and the weight of realization pressed on him like gravity. His eyes widened, and for the first time, the air of absolute certainty that had marked his authority wavered. The passengers, sensing the shift in energy, began to glance forward instinctively. The whispers that had filled the cabin faded into an almost reverent silence. Every person seemed to sense that something monumental was happening, though no one yet fully understood the scale. Some passengers shifted in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was unfolding at the front. Others leaned back, silent, as if instinctively knowing that this was a moment to be observed rather than interrupted. Even the flight attendants who had been quietly buzzing around the aisles paused, frozen mid-step, realizing that the dynamics of authority had just dramatically shifted. The cabin was no longer just a place of travel, it had transformed into a theater, and the woman standing before the pilot was both the center and the unspoken director. The pilot's mind raced, attempting to reconcile what he was seeing with every assumption he had carried into the cabin that day. He had believed himself to be the ultimate authority here, that his role as captain granted him the right to assess, judge, and direct passengers without question. He had assumed that compliance would be automatic, that no one could challenge him in such a small, contained environment. And yet here she stood, the embodiment of power and control, entirely unfazed by his position, entirely unshaken by the chain of command he believed himself to represent. The realization struck him in waves, each one stronger than the last. He had not just misjudged a passenger, he had misjudged the person who held the greatest stake in the very airline he had sworn to command. The irony was almost tangible, thick enough to be felt in the air, wrapping the cockpit and the cabin alike in a sudden, almost sacred tension. She stepped forward, each movement calm and measured, the slight click of her shoes against the cabin floor punctuating the stillness that had fallen. There was no anger in her approach, no trace of irritation at having been dismissed, at having been underestimated, at having been moved without explanation. Instead, there was a serene clarity, an authority rooted not in the need to assert dominance but in the certainty of her position, the power of her vision, and the patience that comes from understanding the value of timing. The pilot, still standing frozen, could only stare, each heartbeat echoing in his chest as the truth began to settle fully around him. She owned the airline. The very airline whose policies, whose hierarchy, whose reputation he had thought granted him unquestionable power. Every command he had issued, every assumption he had relied upon, had been made in error, based on appearances rather than knowledge. The weight of it pressed down on him in a way no procedural checklist or years of experience could have prepared him for. The cabin remained hushed, the silence almost physical, as passengers caught the first glimpse of the interaction unfolding before them. Their eyes darted between the woman and the pilot, some widening in astonishment, some narrowing as they tried to make sense of the sudden shift in dynamics. Some were subtly shifting forward in their seats, leaning toward the spectacle, while others sat back, hesitant to intrude yet utterly captivated. It was a rare moment, one that blurred the lines between authority, respect, and perception. People who had merely watched a routine conflict between crew and passenger now understood, in some intuitive way, that they were witnessing a demonstration of true leadership and composed power, one that transcended conventional titles and uniforms. The woman paused just inside the cockpit threshold, turning slightly to address the pilot directly. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured, yet carried an undeniable weight. There was no trace of reproach or humiliation, only the quiet authority of someone who knows her worth and understands the lesson that must be conveyed. "You may keep your seat," she said, each word deliberate, "but let this flight remind you, respect should never depend on assumptions." The words hung in the air, perfectly balanced between instruction and revelation. The pilot's mind struggled to process the simplicity and profundity of the statement simultaneously. It was a lesson he had never truly been taught in flight school, a principle that could not be learned from manuals or simulators, that authority is not merely a function of position, that respect is not earned by compliance alone, and that assumptions based on appearances are the most dangerous errors a person in power can make. Passengers absorbed the moment in their own ways. Some shifted in their seats, murmuring softly to each other, realizing the magnitude of the exchange they had just witnessed. Others were silent, eyes wide, the realization of how swiftly and completely power could be misjudged settling over them like a blanket. Children, sensing the adult tension, glanced around curiously, while parents kept them close, perhaps hoping to shield them from the lessons unfolding in such a stark and human way. Even those who had originally been skeptical of the woman's authority felt the subtle but undeniable impact of her presence, recognizing that her calm confidence carried weight far beyond what any uniform, title, or seating arrangement could provide. The pilot, still frozen in the cockpit doorway, slowly exhaled, the tension in his shoulders releasing in a mix of relief, embarrassment, and newfound awareness. He could not deny the truth, could not dismiss the weight of her presence or the authority it conveyed. The cabin, the crew, and even the passengers were witnesses to a rare demonstration of leadership, quiet, confident, patient, and utterly effective. The woman's gaze met his briefly, not with malice, not with triumph, but with measured clarity. The unspoken understanding passed between them. Respect is not demanded, it is recognized, cultivated, and upheld through awareness, humility, and acknowledgement of truth. She moved back slightly, stepping aside to allow him to return to his seat, each motion deliberate, precise, and composed. There was no rush, no urgency, only the certainty of someone who had orchestrated the moment with patience and intelligence. As she took her own place, subtly commanding the space without needing to overtly assert dominance, the cabin felt transformed. The previous tension dissipated, replaced by a new equilibrium, one in which authority had been redefined not by assumption but by inherent understanding. Passengers settled back into their seats with a heightened sense of awareness, the entire flight now marked by a quiet reverence for the lesson that had just unfolded in real time. Even as the engines hummed steadily and the plane continued toward its cruising altitude, the impact of that single exchange reverberated throughout the cabin. The flight attendants moved with renewed attention to detail, subtly acknowledging the woman's authority while maintaining professional composure. The pilot, now seated, reviewed his instruments with a thoughtful, almost humbled demeanor, fully aware that the encounter had changed his perception of command and leadership permanently. Each passenger carried away their own interpretation of the moment, a silent acknowledgement that assumptions could no longer be relied upon, that appearances could deceive, and that respect, when truly earned and recognized, was more powerful than any title, uniform, or procedural right. The woman herself remained composed, seated with her small bag neatly placed, her posture relaxed yet commanding. She allowed the cabin to resume its normal rhythm, but there was an unspoken order now, a quiet understanding that had been imprinted on everyone present. It was a subtle but profound demonstration. Authority is not merely exercised, it is recognized, respected, and understood through observation, patience, and the measured use of power. The pilot, crew, and passengers alike had witnessed a lesson that would linger long after the seatbelt signs were turned off. A lesson delivered not with anger or confrontation, but with calm, deliberate authority that required no embellishment to be felt and understood. In that quiet moment, high above the earth, the entire dynamic of the flight had shifted. What had begun as a simple dispute over seating had transformed into a masterclass in leadership, humility, and the profound influence of perception versus reality. The woman's smile, soft but imbued with confidence, radiated a calm authority that did not need to dominate the cabin to command it. Every passenger felt it, consciously or subconsciously, the subtle reminder that assumptions are fragile, that authority without understanding is brittle, and that true power lies not in the assertion of position, but in the measured recognition of truth. The flight continued, smooth and steady, but the lesson, carried in the collective awareness of everyone aboard, remained unmistakable, permanent, and profoundly instructive.